Hello, GOAT Format Duelists. Welcome to GOAT Duels. I'm ACP, and I'm going to give you something a little bit different today. This is going to be sort of a preview to our June meta report where we talk about the 4 coolest decks of the month. But I wanted to make a separate video to kind of talk about the meta as a whole rather than getting into the individual decks and their card choices. And to be honest, one of the big motivators for me making this video is I have a handful of people that just spam comments on my videos about how GOAT format is like a tier 0 format. And, I consider myself to be a pretty rational thinker, so I'm going to sort of go through the data and see if it supports that view of the meta. Spoiler, I don't think it's a tier 0 format, and again, I'm going to go through the meta, and really look at the data to explain why that is. And, of course, if you don't like GOAT format, that's fine. It's not for everyone, but I'm doing this primarily to counter misinformation. Like, maybe people see those comments and get the wrong impression. In particular, so just to get to the data, in particular, I see a lot of comments saying that GOAT format is 70% Chaos Turbo. And needless to say, it's not. I mean, you can see this blue bar here. You don't have to be a math genius to figure out that this isn't 70%. So I don't know why people say that. And again, I don't want new players to get the wrong impression and think that GOAT format is something that it's not. It's not 70% Chaos Turbo, and it never has been. There's never been any tournament that was held, some big tournament, where 70% of the people that entered used Chaos Turbo, or Standard Chaos as I just call it. And I think probably the most that we saw, I mean, we've seen some tournaments where it was 50%, but it's definitely never been anywhere near 70%. And in fact, with this data here, obviously the data can look a little different depending on how you classify the decks. I'm not really here to nitpick about how you classify decks. I will say, though, that at least one deck that was classified as Chaos Turbo was, in my mind, clearly not. I would call this deck Ritual Chaos. Some people would call it Relinquished Chaos. In either case, this deck isn't really Chaos Turbo. So, and there were some decks that weren't classified as Warriors. They had a separate category for, Flip Warrior or something. And, yeah, in my mind, having a few flip effects in a Warrior deck doesn't make it not a Warrior deck. So, again, I'm digressing a little. But, if you look at this pie chart here, I just want to talk about this pie chart. And I do like the fact that Format Library made this pie chart of the meta. I appreciate that. I love data. I definitely love this data, even though it might not be perfect. But, you look at this pie chart, and forget about the decks here. Forget about the deck names. Just look at this pie chart here. Look at all these colors. Does this look like a diverse meta to you? That is obviously going to be subjective, right? What exactly do you consider diverse? To me, I would, right? I mean, we've got 4 decks here that are about 75% of the meta, and, a bunch of other decks taking up 25%. Now, when you look at the decks that made Top Cut, and we will as part of this video, you'll see that it's mostly Chaos Turbo and Warriors. So the way that I would classify GOAT format's meta at this point in time is that I would call it, and listen carefully, I would call it a diverse 2-deck meta. And I know some people are already about to write their comments, go, what the hell is a diverse 2-deck meta? That just sounds like a blatant contradiction. So I mean in the sense that, say you have some sort of 2-deck meta, right? And Deck A makes up 60% of the meta, Deck B makes up 35% of the meta, and then all of the other decks in the format make up the other 5%. Now, I would classify that as a non-diverse 2-deck meta, in the sense that you really have 2 decks that are just representing the whole format. Yeah, there might be a few other decks sprinkled in there, but those other decks might be from people who are non-competitive or maybe can't afford the cards in the best 2 decks or whatever. Whereas a diverse 2-deck meta, and we've had this before actually, GOAT format's meta actually reminds me a lot of what the meta was like in the spring of 2011. That I would also classify as a diverse 2-deck meta. In the spring of 2011, the 2 decks were Six Samurai and Gravekeepers, but then you had some other decks that were putting up good numbers with smaller representation, like X-Sabers, Frog Monarch, Fish OTK, Dragoonity, E-Heroes, Plants, Blackwings, right? Now you could say that, okay, well, those 7 other decks that I just named, outside of the 2, maybe some of them were really just kind of a step below the other decks. And, again, you're kind of entitled to think what you want. I'm just kind of here to discuss the numbers. But yeah, I would call GOAT format a diverse 2-deck meta in the sense that 2 decks are really getting a pretty sizable majority, a statistically significant majority of the top cut slots. However, it is far from the case that, like, oh, those are the only good decks. I mean, even in this particular tournament, we see that second place was a deck outside of that 2-deck meta. It was Chaos Control. And now some people would say, oh, okay, so you basically just took your Chaos Turbo deck and you threw in 3 Metamorphosis and 2 Scapegoats, and you're trying to say that's a different deck. I mean, again, how you classify decks, it's somewhat subjective. You could say, like, well, every deck has Blackluster Soldier in it, so it's not really that diverse. Or, every deck here has Magician of Faith in it, so it's not really that diverse. You could say, well, both first and second place decks had Chaos Sorcerer and Thunder Dragon, although this deck only had 1 Chaos Sorcerer. So again, what you consider to be diverse is somewhat subjective. And of course, you do have staples in GOAT format, like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Delinquent Duo, that basically every deck's going to have. So it's not diverse in that sense. So what I would kind of encourage you to think about is not really to sort of focus on what you consider diversity to be, but more of how fun you think the format is, right? Just based on this pie chart, right, you can debate how the decks were classified, but based on this pie chart, I would say this is more diverse than most Yu-Gi-Oh metas are historically, right? Even if we take, like, I don't know, some of these decks that are all one-ofs, even if you take all the one-ofs and lump them into an other category, still quite diverse. And to me, what's important when I look at a meta is not so much, is there a deck that has a lot of representation? It's more of, is that deck beatable? To what extent is it beatable? Because, I've played Yu-Gi-Oh for a very long time. I've played card games in general for a very long time. So I've seen my fair share of straight up tier 0 formats. I played Teledent format. I played Zodiac format. And to be honest, those are really the 2 that come to my mind as being like, you had one deck that was just super dominant, and if you were playing anything else, like, you were just kind of an idiot. Like, in Zodiac format, like, yes, you had pure Zodiac and you had Draco Zodiac, and you could say, well, those are 2 different decks, so it's not really, a 1-deck format, but it's like, okay, the Zodiac engine was still, like, you just had to be playing it. Whereas in GOAT format, there's not really one engine that you have to play. Like, yes, the most popular engine is definitely Chaos Sorcerer plus Thunder Dragon plus, Raigeki Break or Phoenix Windblast. That is definitely the most popular engine in GOAT format, and it's a powerful engine. It's popular for a reason. And if you think that, oh, that engine is lame, it sucks that GOAT format is dominated by that particular engine, okay, that's a fair view to have, right? You don't have to like everything. I'm not saying that, oh, you have to like this or you shouldn't like this. Historically, if we look at GOAT format, over time, from the revival until now, it's always been fairly diverse, and to me, if anything, it seems like it's getting more diverse. There was a time when, if you're playing GOAT format, like 75% of the decks were GOAT control, and people didn't really complain. Now, there might be reasons for that. I think there's really 2 reasons why that could have been the case. Either A, people just really liked the gameplay of GOAT control, and so therefore they didn't care it was 75% of the meta. And B, you could say that, well, that was kind of back when GOAT format was new as a, like, revival format, and everyone who played back then kind of knew what they were getting into, and hence they all liked GOAT control being the best deck, or they wouldn't have started playing in the first place. But yeah, historically, GOAT format is actually more diverse, again, based on the way this pie chart looks, than it has been over, other periods of time. Like I said, for Worlds last year, this blue bar here, instead of being, there's 134 people in this tournament. So you'll see that 51 over 134 is 38% of the field. And again, I don't really consider the deck with Manjus to be Chaos Turbo. So about 38% of the field. And then if we look at the top 8, okay, we have, 1 Chaos Turbo deck, we have 2, we have 3. I would not consider this Chaos Turbo. Most people would not either. So, depending on your viewpoint, either 3 out of 8, which is 37%, or, 4 out of 8, which is obviously 50% of the, the top cut slots were Chaos Turbo. And now if you go down to, 9th, 11th, 12th, so on, yeah, we do see more Chaos Turbo decks, right? Like if we look at, both of the 9th place decks, both were Chaos Turbo, then we have Warriors, then we have Chaos Turbo, then Warriors, Chaos, Warriors. I mean, they classify this as Gear Freed. I don't know. To me, whether you consider this a separate deck than Warriors is, again, open to interpretation. So yes, we do see a lot of Chaos Turbo. And again, to me, like, what's more important than, like, what percentage of the meta is A, is the gameplay good, and B, is the deck beatable? And obviously, neither of those questions really have a definitive answer. Looking at the other major tournament, we see here Warriors got 1st, 3rd, and 4th. And this was a bigger tournament. It was a more stacked tournament. It was just harder, more grueling. And, I'll be honest, from me talking to, like, the tippy top GOAT format players, most of them actually have the view that if GOAT format is a tier 0 format, Warriors are more likely to be the real tier 0 deck than Chaos. In the sense that, like, if you have a 2-deck format, usually the deck that wins heads up is better in the format. So, in other words, and this was true even in 2011 also, which, again, very similar format. You had Gravekeepers and Six Samurai being, like, the 2 decks of the format, and Six Samurai was favored versus Gravekeepers, and hence, myself and a lot of other people just said, well, I'm just going to play Samurai then, because it's the one deck that beats the other one deck. And by the same logic, I think if you were to play either Chaos Turbo or Warriors, I think Warriors is very clearly a better meta call. But again, that's opinion. That's opinion. I'm not here to, tell you what to think necessarily. But what is interesting, I'll go back to these statistics. And I think, by the way, these statistics are fairly representative. I don't think we have, like, some big outliers here. Like, 16 people played GOAT Control, but normally it would be much more or much less than that. I think these statistics are pretty normal. So Chaos Turbo was about twice as popular as Warriors in this tournament. Now, again, it can vary depending on the exact tournament, but I've seen that to be about the case. Chaos Turbo is the most popular, Warriors are the second most popular, but Chaos more so. What is interesting to me is that if we look at, sort of a broad base of tournaments put together, Chaos Turbo isn't really winning much more than Warriors is in terms of its ability to get top cut slots. And to me, that's interesting because, like, what I always look at is what decks are outperforming their representation. Say some deck was 50% of the meta in any game, right? Forget Yu-Gi-Oh, forget Go format. You've got some sort of meta somewhere, and deck A is 50% of the meta. If you had to assign odds for that deck to win a tournament, you would probably say it's about 50% odds. Now, if we saw that in spite of deck A being 50% of the meta, it was actually winning 70% of the tournaments, you'd probably be like, wow, that deck must be super, super dominant over the rest of the field because it's outperforming its representation. Whereas if deck A was winning only 30% of the tournaments, then you might be like, okay, this deck is underperforming its representation. It's, not as good as you would think by just looking at the meta, and hence that deck is probably beatable. It's probably overplayed. Maybe a lot of bad players are using that deck for some reason. Like, maybe it's really cheap and easy to pick up or something. And I will say, in GOAT format, I do think that, the standard Chaos deck is the easiest deck to pick up. Like, for newer players that just kind of want to play kind of like a straightforward, no nonsense strategy. And that's fine. It's good that there are decks that are easy to pick up, but I think that skews the representation a little. So to me, like, this deck being 38% of the meta, I don't think that in and of itself means that deck is tier 0 or overpowered or something along those lines. And, so I'll just say that my experiences, again, focus, in order for a deck to be tier 0, it has to be unbeatable. And I think basically any GOAT format player, you talk to any of these players that top this tournament or topped other tournaments, you go, is this standard Chaos deck, is it unbeatable? Is it super dominant? And they would say no. They'd go, like every other deck, it has strengths and weaknesses. Now, if you're a great player, can you win with this deck? Well, yeah, of course, someone just did. But, what we see, again, like looking at the other tournament, is, Warriors do pretty well against Chaos. At a minimum. I think pretty much almost every player will agree to that. Warriors has the natural advantage against the standard Chaos deck. We've got Blade Knight. We've got Kaiku. We've got Mystic Swordsman. We've got, Mind Control. We've got Trap Dust Shoot, right? Trap Dust Shoot. And all those cards are just really good against Chaos. It's a really good package. There's a reason that Warriors win so much. And it's because that deck does very well against Chaos. So, to me, it's so weird how these people, like, simultaneously argue that, it's a tier 0 format, but then, like, other decks are beating that tier 0 deck all the time. Like, this isn't some irregular thing. It's not like in a year we have 10 tournaments and 9 out of 10 are won by Chaos Turbo, and then you could say, well, the other one's a fluke. Like, it's not even 8 out of 10. Based on the data that I've seen, and, someone can correct me if I'm insane here, but the standard Chaos deck, it's about 40% of the meta, 38% in this case, maybe 37%, but it's about 40% of the meta, and it wins about 40% of the tournaments. To me, that indicates a fair, beatable deck that, again, has strengths and weaknesses. And, last month we also had, like, a Reasoning Gate deck win a tournament. And, I mean, obviously you could have the viewpoint, well, that's a fluke. I don't think that. I mean, I've played pretty much every deck in GOAT format. And I would say, if I was going into a tournament with standard Chaos, I would be worried about Warriors, Reasoning Gate, Burn, Rescue Cat, and I'll probably also like Chaos Return, if the player is good. We really only have like 1 or 2 players that put up good numbers with Chaos Return, but I think Chaos Return also has a good matchup against the standard Chaos list. So I just need 5 decks that I think are favored versus the standard Chaos list. And maybe you only think, no, I think 2 of those decks suck, and, maybe the other 3 are favored. But in either case, I think pretty much everyone can agree that there are decks that are at least slightly favored versus the standard Chaos list. And even versus decks that I think are universally agreed to not be favored versus Chaos, like pretty much everyone agrees, like, GOAT Control is not favored versus a deck like this. It's just not. However, that doesn't mean that, like, GOAT Control is unplayable. Like, you can overcome that bad matchup and still put up good results. So again, when I played in formats like Teledad and Zodiac, like, those decks were just so overpowered that, like, it's comparable to, like, running a race with one leg. Like, you're just so massively handicapped that, like, you can be the best player in the world and, like, you're just still not going to crush tournaments very much if you're playing something other than those 2 decks. I think my main point is, like, I think people overuse the phrase tier 0, and I think people, like, don't, like, I think most people, like, have seen these statistics, but somehow in their head they, like, inflate it. Like, they see, 40%, they see 38% as Chaos Turbo, then they round up to 40%, the way that I just did, and then, someone else says, oh yeah, well, 40% is almost 50%, and then someone's like, well, 50% is almost 70%, and then you have all these people going around saying that Chaos Turbo is 70% of the meta, and it's just nowhere near that. So I don't know. Am I just insane here, guys? Let me know in the comments.